who and why has been spreading disinformation in the context of the EU's climate policies?
Every day, we hear that climate change is humanity's greatest challenge. We ask ourselves about the impact we are having on the world and whether we, as a species, have a future. Good evening, my name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. Researchers have identified a mental state they call climate anxiety. They say continuous, daily exposure to news about climate-related disasters can elicit a physical response that includes a racing heartbeat and shortness of breath. It can impact our relationships and affect how we function at work or school. And climate change disinformation is a big part of influence operations run by malign actors. What actually is climate change? And how does it impact our health and lives? Are some parts of the world more vulnerable than others? And what can we do to mitigate climate change? The European Green Deal was supposed to be a key policy point in this year's European elections, but instead it became one of the most attacked issues during the campaign. I look forward to talking about all this and more with our first guest.
Professor Sir Andy Haines, Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Sir Andy Haines developed an interest in climate change and health in the 1990s and was a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the second, third, and fifth assessment exercises. He chaired the Scientific Advisory Panel for the 2013 WHO World Health Report, the Rockefeller-Lancet Commission on Planetary Health, and the European Academy's Science Advisory Council Working Group on Climate Change and Health. He co-chaired the Inter-Academy Partnership Working Group on Climate Change and Health and is currently co-chairing the Lancet Pathfinder Commission on Health in the Zero-Carbon Economy. He was, until recently, the co-director of the WHO Collaborating Center on Climate Change, Sustainable Development and Health at LSHTM and was awarded the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2022.
Welcome, Andy. Thank you so much for joining us today at the episode of the Anatomy of Disinformation when we focus on the climate change. What is the impact of the climate change on our health?
Well, thank you for inviting me. Climate change has a number of impacts on human health. The most obvious one, of course, is extreme heat, increasing exposure to extreme heat, which, as we know, increases the death rates, particularly amongst elderly people, but not just amongst elderly people. We also know that people are affected by increasing floods, droughts, extreme storms, and each of those can have an impact on physical health and also mental health. So, for example, after exposure to floods, when you follow populations up that have been exposed to floods, you find quite a high level of depression and other common mental disorders following floods and indeed wildfires and other extreme events. Climate change can also affect the quality of the air that we breathe. So after wildfires, for example, people are exposed to sometimes high levels of air pollution, which can increase the risks of death from cardiac disease, from respiratory disease as well. Also, climate change affects the risk of many infectious diseases. The obvious one is are diseases that are transmitted by mosquitoes, like dengue, for example, many other diseases that are transmitted by insects. The effects of climate change on the availability and the quality of fresh water. So fresh water is more likely to be contaminated, for example.
So there's particularly huge different reasons why we need to look at the climate change and the health-related issues with it. Are there particular regions or countries more vulnerable than others?
Well, in general terms, low-income countries are more exposed to climate threats, but the whole world is affected. You know, we're all affected in different ways.
We just had floods in Poland, so yes, definitely we saw that what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we saw the Central European floods, for example, and we know that the intensity of those floods, the size of the magnitude of them, was affected by human-induced climate change. So the effects are being felt all over the planet, but they're felt differently in different countries.
And the temperature in general in the world is increasing systematically year by year. And every summer pretty much is being said that it's more, it's higher and the temperature is higher and it's more heat coming on, and it's also affecting the health of the people that are living in European countries, for example, right?
Yes, absolutely. If you look at the global average temperature, it's about 1.2 degrees, a global average increase of what it would have been without climate change. But some parts of the world, including Europe, are heating up more quickly than the global average. And of course, as you say, we are being impacted on in Europe by extreme heat, which we know increases death rate, wildfires in some parts of Europe, and the floods that we've already talked about. We're also seeing the spread of some diseases across Europe, diseases, for example, transmitted by mosquitoes as a result of climate change. And we're seeing
so those are the diseases that before we only saw in Africa, for example, or the other countries, and we already see them in Europe, right?
Well, we're seeing, for example, the dengue. There's a mosquito that transmits dengue, which is a very, very common virus infection. It's a very unpleasant and sometimes fatal infection around the world. We're seeing that mosquito is now spreading in Europe. So we're expecting that there will be more cases of dengue transmitted in Europe. And that's not the only infection that's increasing as a result of climate change, but it's one example.
So what is important? Can we stop this change, or do we need to adapt to change?
We need to do two things, really. We need to adapt to the change that we can't prevent, because we're already, as I've said, at 1.2 degrees, and we're probably, unfortunately, going to break 1.5 degrees before too long. But we also need to mitigate or cut emissions, cutting emissions rapidly in order to reduce the risk of dangerous climate change. But by
how can we do it? How can we do it? What are the important points that we can make?
Well, there are several ways of cutting emissions. Well, the most important thing is to reduce burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are the major contributor to climate change, but they also contribute to air pollution. So as we move towards clean renewable energy, we also clean the air that we breathe, and that will benefit our health. So it's a double benefit for the climate and benefit for human health.
And you've also been telling us on the impact on our psychological health, right? Which is very important because there is climate anxiety. And if we are talking about disinformation, it's also working on our fear and making us more vulnerable in these terms.
Yes, I mean, climate anxiety is particularly experienced by young people, as you know. Some studies have suggested that nearly 50% of young people across a range of countries are suffering from such extreme climate anxiety, it's affecting their level of functioning. Of course, disinformation can contribute to that, but what's really important is to take action, because many of these young people feel that politicians are not taking sufficient action to safeguard their future and their health. So accelerating action to cut emissions is really important, as well as adapting to the change that we can't prevent.
And that can be done by the governments, but also by the multilateral organizations, right? How we can, what are the steps that multilateral organizations also are taking? You've been working with some of them.
Yes, so there are a number of steps that these multilateral organizations are taking, like the World Health Organization, for example, is helping countries to reduce the health effects by adapting more effectively to climate change by putting in place early warning systems for heat and infectious diseases and so on. But they're also helping and supporting the healthcare system to decarbonize, to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, because the healthcare system is responsible for about 5% of global emissions, something like that. So it is an important player and can contribute to cutting greenhouse gas emissions.
And how important in here is the awareness raising?
Well, awareness raising is very important because ultimately political leaders respond to the public opinion, don't they? So as we raise awareness, both about the threats of climate change to health, but also the benefits of action, climate action, this can help to increase the pressures on politicians, on decision makers, to make steps towards a low carbon and more healthy economy. And that's what we need to do very rapidly over the years to come.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you for your expertise and the call to action. We all can make a change.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's now see how Russia was involved in the farmers' protests that hugely impacted the EU's green agenda this year.
Who and why has been spreading disinformation in the context of the EU's climate policies?
What we can see is that in the context of the 2024 European elections, we saw how Russian propaganda outlets like RT and Sputnik and some far-right blocs across Europe too attacked the European Green Deal, the energy transition project and policies, and they did so in three ways. First, manipulative narratives addressed real grievances of the people. For example, the cost of living that is rising due to the energy transition is targeted, and this is exploiting fears of economic decline due to these policies. And the policies are presented as misguided, so politicians do not know what they are doing. Second, narratives respond to breaking news events. So we had these farmers' protests across Europe just a couple of weeks ahead of the elections, and employing a people versus elites rhetoric, narratives framed these protests as kind of a revolt against oppression from Brussels, against some climate tyranny was a common framing. And third, narratives linked to Russian propaganda, especially war propaganda, which we see quite often actually. So, for example, EU subsidies for Ukrainian farmers were blamed for the ruin of EU farmers, and by that trying to erode support for Ukraine in its defense against Russia. The reason why Russia is especially targeting the green transition, I think, is twofold. For one, Russia has a vital interest in economies based on fossil fuel. So obviously, Moscow does not have an interest in a carbon neutral EU, which would then be independent of fossil fuels, as this would simply weaken Russia's geopolitical position. So it's in the interest of Russia to sow division between the member states and to weaken Brussels and to erode really support for climate policies. Russia has a vital geopolitical interest in Africa. And an interesting thing that the analysis showed is that the green transition taking place in Europe is being framed as a threat to African economies. So the logic is, due to a decrease of fossil fuel imports, African economies and African people are suffering. This is supposed to strain really the relationship between Africa and the EU and open up a space, a void for Russia to step in, to say, we might be the better partner, we might have solutions for your problems, and the Europeans are not to be trusted.
The European institutions have their own definition of climate disinformation. It's described as intentional actions that seek to undermine trust in science, weaken public support of climate actions, and erode democracy. And in this year's Global Risk Report, the World Economic Forum ranked mis- and disinformation as the biggest short-term risks to human society, with extreme weather events topping the list of long-term risks. As we can see, the correlation is strong. We'll find out more from our next guest.
I'm Siewiorek, Senior Campaign Lead at Climate and Strategy Foundation. An expert in climate communication, Anna is experienced in designing and running climate and social campaigns, including in the area of countering climate disinformation and engaging vulnerable groups. She is a member of the Council of NGOs for the Polish presidency of the Council of the European Union. Her professional history ranges Polish and foreign NGOs and social impact agencies, including Amnesty International Poland, Anna Dymna's Despite Everything Foundation, and the Purpose Climate Lab. She has studied in Poland, the Netherlands, and in Singapore.
Ania, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome, thank you for having me.
Climate disinformation is a huge security issue. But what actually is climate change disinformation?
So when we think about climate disinformation and misinformation, because I think some of the audience of the program already knows that, but I will mention that again. So the term to differentiate disinformation and misinformation is intentionality. So in terms of climate disinformation, that means we want to misinform people about climate change. We want to undermine the existence or the impacts of climate change. We want to undermine the unequivocal human influence of climate change or the need for corresponding urgent actions. So basically, climate disinformation, this is like many tactics to basically somehow cause harm or push public to think about different solutions in a different way. So basically that interferes with the security, that interferes with some actions we would like, pro-climate actions we need to take according to the climate consensus, IPCC reports, or Paris Agreement.
And do you know why is that? Is it to actually change those agendas, or is it more to destabilize and polarize the society?
Basically both. First of all, here it's the right time to mention the newest NATO report from this year, saying that for the very first time, mentioning climate disinformation as a global threat to all the NATO members. Of course, they present climate change as the biggest threat, but climate disinformation, very often coming from Kremlin, Russia, or China, is causing even more threats, destabilizing societies, causing many harms, underlying trust towards the institutions, governmental institutions, but also global institutions like the European Union institutions, and polarizing society. And that means it takes more time to actually take proper climate action, and that's in favor of some of the agendas from abroad.
And because climate change and climate issue in general, it's so high in the agenda, and there's a huge awareness about it. I think that's why it's also very much used by the malign actors on this. But we can talk on the higher level, but also what does it mean to us as people, where we can see those particular cases of this kind of disinformation?
Well, there are many different conspiracy theories. There are many different plots we can find online, on social media, through bloggers or different forums. So big tech is also quite responsible for the spread of climate disinformation. I will give you some examples that are that picture quite nicely what this climate disinformation is about. One comes from 15-minute city. There's this amazing concept of a walkable city that should be green, so should be sustainable and pro-human. Like the concept is that we can reach everything we need from the park to the hospital within a 15 minutes walk or bike ride.
So it makes our lives more comfortable, right?
Exactly. On many levels, but for some people, through some conspiracy theories, they present it as a way for governments to control us. So this is for us, for sure. It sounds ridiculous or quite abstract, but there are some echo chambers or groups that strongly believe that this is true. Same happens with the automotive lobby and the concept of sustainable transport and EV. So the push from the automotive lobby is so strong that they try to present EVs and electric cars as a threat. And a good example comes from London when they try to introduce low emission zones that are pro clean air, and also that requires the change of the public transportation towards EV. And the recent example from this year was about presenting a double-decker, a red double-decker from London on fire with flames and smoke. And basically it went viral. It had a couple of 100,000 of views and it was commented heavily. But the fact was that it was from 2 years ago. It wasn't an EV, it was a diesel, and it didn't happen in London. So we can see how many different ways of twisting some messages can be visible online. So there is no limit, and it's actually very easy to be misinformed, and because this information is basically designed to evoke fear, evoke anger, some strong emotions, and even some research shows us that it spreads 6 times faster than the valid information, and it has 70% chances more to be actually shared through social media. So the threat is serious.
And those videos, for example, coming back to the London example, they were targeted to the Londoners, or they were spread all over the world in different channels, or do you know if they were having rather particular channels where they've been visible?
Basically, they are very often targeted to certain echo chambers, but when the message like this goes viral, it spreads. So for sure, it was targeted towards Londoners, or in particular, like people from Great Britain. But in general, it was possible for us also to read about it, to show
the media, right?
Photos through social media, especially through X, former Twitter. It's said that's the biggest source of climate disinformation recently.
Yes, there is no trust and safety whatsoever. And I remember also the case around Al Gore and Exxon. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, Al Gore, the former vice president of the United States and a very keen climate activist, a couple of years ago, I think it was more than 10 years ago, prepared a movie, one of the very first documentary on climate change. And it also went viral for good cause. But some people commented it in a way that was against climate action. And a good example of astroturfing, which means basically an activity that looks like a grassroots activity coming from concerned citizens, but in fact comes from PR agencies or fossil fuel companies and is backed up by huge money. So basically, there was a person coming from the United States preparing a homemade video against Al Gore's movie. It went viral. It was heavily commented. People agreed with that 28-year-old man. And it looked very real, and it looked really homemade, and that's why people somehow connected to this message. But after an investigation run by the journalists from the Washington Post, if I remember correctly, they found out that behind all this, there was a huge PR agency connected to the ExxonMobil, which is one of the biggest fossil fuel players worldwide. So it wasn't clean. It wasn't. It didn't come from a concerned citizen at all.
Thank you for joining us and for those very important points that we learned about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. What do we mean when we say astroturfing? Let's take a look at the definition.
How is astroturfing used to create a false perception of widespread public support? Astroturfing is a strategy that hides the true actors or funders behind a message or organization, making it appear as an independent grassroots movement. Its goal is to artificially inflate the perception of widespread public support for a particular cause. For example, astroturfing can involve posting fake reviews on online forums to promote a product, or in politics, create fake grassroots groups and networks to boost support for a candidate.
Climate change disinformation can be extremely harmful. Not only does it increase our anxiety levels, it also tries to influence public opinion to prevent us from taking necessary action. That's why it's good to understand the problem, check the facts, and remember that we are saving the planet for our kids and future generations. See you next week. And until then, keep calm and think deeply.